Okay, fantastic. We have been given the green light to start. Thank you for, let me move this a little bit further forward. Thank you for joining us in the Conservative home tent here at Party Conference. It's been a fantastic conference so far, lots of interesting discussions, and today we're going to be talking about something that is extremely important for this country, both in terms of our net zero target, but in terms of jobs, infrastructure, and so on. So we've got a fantastic panel here. We're going to be discussing investment in infrastructure to deliver cleaner homegrown energy, how to do it, where we should be investing, jobs, and so on. So, and also perhaps we'll touch on skills as well. So the Conservative government does have a strong record of delivery in the energy sector in terms of decarbonisation, but we're going to be looking at the power system fundamentally in this conversation. So the role that clean energy infrastructure can play in creating jobs, boosting our economy and protecting our security, as well as exploring new polling on attitudes to homegrown energy. Sounds very interesting indeed. So let me introduce my wonderful panel. We have Sam Peacock, Managing Director for Corporate Affairs, Regulation and Strategy at SSE. We have Tom Lubbock, Founding Director at JL Partners. We have Catherine Fletcher, MP, Science, Innovation and Technology Committee member, and she is the MP for South Ribble. I've just been told exactly where that is. Thank you. And we have Chris Skidmore, who's a former Energy Minister and Chair of the UK Independent Net Zero Review. So who better to talk to? I think it's probably a good idea if I give you about 2-3 minutes just to give your perspective. So let's start from the top. Let's start with Sam.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for coming and for organising it. Appreciate it. So from my end, I suppose I'm an impatient optimist when it comes to energy infrastructure delivery. I think there's lots to be optimistic about. I think there's consensus on the direction. I think there's consensus on the technologies. And I think there's incredible advantages in the UK, be it wind, CCUS, etc. I think policy, you know, we'll probably talk about policy quite a bit today, but I think policy, sort of the instruments are largely there. And it's about really making the UK an easy place to invest in. I suppose my perspective that I bring as SSE is we're an infrastructure company. We've got 40 billion to spend over the next decade. We want to spend it in this country. At the moment, we probably can spend it in offshore wind. We're building more than any other company in the world right now, and I think that the mechanisms can be fixed. Onshore wind, I think we can invest in that in this country at the moment as well. Nuclear is a bit too big a sort of pill for SSE to bite. But when you come back to the other things you want to invest in, so transmission, the pylons that take the energy to our homes, I think that we've now got a strategic framework in place for that. We just need to take the communities with us. I think government and Ofgem have done quite a good job on that. We haven't quite seen the progress on the smaller grids, sort of the more localised grids, so we haven't quite got an investable sort of framework for strategic investment yet. And probably the last thing I would just touch on is the bit where I think we've been very slow as a country actually is the flexibility side. So ultimately when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, we're going to need some form of low carbon flexibility. I think the government is kind of on track for building 1 CCUS plant. We probably need about 10. And likewise, we're going to need to see hydrogen and pump storage kicking on. So the good news to close from me is I think all of this is fixable. Actually, I think if we prioritise as a country pace over perfection, I think if we buy a whole bunch of cheaper low carbon energy today, that will be in the country's long-term interests. And I'll probably leave with one final stat, which is if we had the 2030 energy system in 2022, as a country, we would have spent 30 billion less on gas. So that just shows you that this stuff makes economic sense for people. So I'm an optimist, just an impatient one, but I do think the energy system we all want is well within our grasp.
Sam, our impatient optimist. I think that's a good way for all of us to be honest. Tom, Founding Director of JL Partners, Public Opinion Specialist. I'd love to hear your perspective on how how energy infrastructure is going down with the great British public.
Thanks so much. I think the first thing that we should definitely acknowledge is that the public don't spend a lot of time as a whole thinking about where electricity comes from. The word infrastructure is probably one that most of the public would not really recognise in their everyday lives. And in terms of the grid, it's not something that people think about very often. Now, that's the kind of caveat. The really positive news, and I think this is exactly as we've heard already, the positive news is that when you put specific proposals to the public, carbon capture and storage, any kind of renewable project which reduces our reliance on fossil fuels that are imported from abroad, these are things that garner really kind of strong public approval and up into the kind of 90% agreement with those projects, support for those projects. We touched on also local support. Now, obviously, there's been a huge debate recently about how you get local support for grid projects, for infrastructure. And that's a more difficult question. But as with the infrastructure debate more generally, the really important thing is that people don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. And then all of a sudden, when something happens, they do. They spend a lot of time thinking about it when a project comes to their area. And the key thing is to have the messages, have the reassurance, and have the strategy in place to understand what people's concerns are and to put those two things together, that real demand for infrastructure and grid capacity that reduces our reliance on fossil fuels that are imported and increases energy security in the UK, with perhaps those concerns they may have locally about projects for them. So it's a really, really positive picture in terms of public opinion and net zero. I actually think the Prime Minister's announcements, and I think we might talk about this a bit more, are really kind of neither here nor there in terms of the bigger picture for the public and net zero. I think it was a really important move to make, but actually, big picture, it doesn't really change. It doesn't change the public's demand for net zero. It's still there. They still want energy security above all else, and 2022 has had that real impact. People have really noticed that by relying on fossil fuels that are imported from abroad, we put ourselves in a really dangerous position.
Fantastic. Yes, I think most people want cheap, secure, and preferably green energy. So it's how we deliver that to people. Catherine, your constituency, you have some energy infrastructure coming your way.
Yeah, so as I've just explained, I've unilaterally renamed it the bit under Preston, because nobody has any idea where that is. And South Ribble, lovely part of the world. I'm really interested in what Tom's got to say about this. I have a huge substation right on the Lancashire coast, and in the current national grid plans it's going to be the landing point for a lot of the new offshore wind that's going on off the Lancashire coast and between us and the Isle of Man. And that actually is getting quite a lot of community buy-in. They understand that there's green jobs there. They understand that it's great. They're concerned that they think a massive pipe is going to go through two triple SIs in the Ribble estuary, which is, a problem to be solved. And I think actually, certainly in Lancashire, we've got such a strong engineering heritage that the questions of how are as important as something else. So Tom's mentioned the Prime Minister's announcement recently. I was actually phoned up by my plumber electrician, who helped me put one of those monitoring systems on my gas-fired central heating, to allow me to move it. And he had a rant at me for about 20 minutes about how we were going to make it illegal. We were going to fine him 15 grand if he didn't put a heat pump on his house. And it was absolutely ridiculous because the grid wasn't there, the electrification challenge, we're not producing enough energy. And what the Prime Minister did with that announcement, I think he's just stopped dead a lot of the rumour mill that was really getting very out of hand with people. Because if the guy whose job it is to install, kind of alternative forms of electrification for households thinks that that's what's happening and he's cross about it, we're not winning. In terms of the energy security thing, I would completely agree. But what people want to see is something that actually is meaningful to them and their lives. Because they'll say, I'd love an electric car, but it's going to blow the local substation. I'd love a heat pump, but I don't think it works. Or, the power goes off in winter quite a bit. I'm right by the coast in South Ribble. you get 3 geese going through it and the electricity's off. People are quite reasonably saying, why I can't electrify my house to decarbonise my lifestyle. So there's lots of the personal stuff. And I think there was 2 announcements recently. For my sins, I sat on the Energy Bill Committee for 6 weeks of line-by-line scrutiny of 1.5 inches of legislation. And one of the things within that I think is really interesting, which is the future systems operator. I think the most important part of the PM's recent announcement has kind of been lost in the headlines, which is his plan for the grid. Because I've got businesses that have got 2/3 of their roofs with solar panels on, even when their industrial unit is a massive fridge, because they're a food cash and carry business. And I said, oh, why haven't you done the last third? Council wouldn't let us. We can't get the grid connection. And I think whilst the national energy infrastructure is important for scale, for achieving our objectives, my comment to you guys would be about making sure we take the smaller end with us to build community support. You're a business, you want to put a wind turbine up, great. You're a business, you want to put solar powers up, great. Then, how do we get a grid connection for smaller specification stuff? Because then when you want to put the gargantuan pipe into Howick Cross, it's already happening. People understand it on a human scale. I think I'd be interested to hear what the audience's questions are later.
Yes, we will get to those. Chris, Catherine's given her perspective on Rishi Sunak's recent speech. He was seen to roll back on some of the banning of things for consumers mainly. What was your perspective? What was hidden in that speech that people may not have noticed?
Thanks, Emily, and thanks to Conhome for this opportunity. I think the title of the event, focusing on infrastructure, it reminds me of when Tony Blair said his priorities were education, education, education. If we're going to deliver net zero on time by 2050, our priority must be grid, grid, grid. And the net zero review was very clear. It had 10-year missions sort of set out, and the first mission was grid and infrastructure. And obviously with that, we've got energy sort of sectors such as nuclear, solar, where we took forward a new target of 70 gigawatts by 2035. But also a net zero roadmap was a key recommendation of the net zero review, which would say not just what we need to achieve going forwards, but working backwards. What does the energy mix look not just in 2050, but in 2035 and 2030? And actually, one of the Prime Minister's announcements in his speech has been this sort of spatial plan for grid. So I welcome that. Just as I welcome actually the uplift in the boiler upgrade scheme to £7,500, which I think apparently has seen a 500% uplift in the number of people interested in now taking up a heat pump. So actually, when it came to the detail of some of the Prime Minister's announcements, they were very welcome and actually reflected some of the recommendations in the net zero review. I also felt, in that sort of speech, that when we look now a week on at some of the policy detail that's been published, to use Theresa May's words, nothing has changed.
Correct.
When you look at, for instance, the EV mandate, it's unchanged from when it was published in the consultation in March. And even the net zero review stated, obviously, and let's go back, let's be clear also, it's interesting what Catherine's saying about messaging, that the net zero strategy published in 2021, first line was that let us be clear, no one is going to be forced to remove their gas boiler, no one is going to be forced to sell their petrol car. Even with the 2030 target and the 2035 target, that was always the case, that this was, for new gas boilers wouldn't be sold. And you simply, at the end of your life of your gas boiler, when you needed to replace your gas boiler, you wouldn't replace like with like. You would replace it with a future heat pump.
Are heat pumps good? Because I get
Yes.
loads of messages and emails saying, oh, I had this heat pump installed and it's dreadful and it doesn't keep my home warm and all of this.
You can. It doesn't matter what your energy source is. If your house is a colander, it's not going to work. The heat pumps work, but they don't work in houses that are colanders. It's the energy efficiency challenge. And that's why you can get there, because you can make your house burn less gas, and then you can just slot a heat pump in when you've got the cash.
I think the challenge with heat pumps is some people have fitted them in homes that were inappropriate for the heat pump to be put in place. And that's an important sort of reflection of where we need to create supporting policy frameworks around, say, for instance, like net zero passport. So the energy performance certificate is not fit for purpose. If you put a heat pump in place, your energy performance certificate potentially goes backwards. That is something that urgently needs to be resolved. And, you know,
And there's also too many of them have been done by somebody's mate 5 years ago, and they've said, oh, well, we'll just give you a C.
But the challenge is, and I always think, you know, with this transition, is that net zero is not something to be feared. You know, the net zero review was to recognise the economic opportunity that we have, not just to get off expensive gas and to create greater energy security, but to create the economic opportunity for new jobs, new industries of the future, knowing that this change is here. It doesn't matter what Rishi Sunak says, it doesn't matter what Claire Coutinho says. You know, as politicians, the change is happening. Investors are making investment decisions based on clean and renewable power, not on fossil fuels. And so the challenge is recognising, in the same way we've gone through transitions in the past, one of those transitions actually being getting off coal, hearth to actually essential heating, that, you know, this will happen. In the same way, 11% of all households when I became an MP had smart TVs, the price point came down, the learning cost of the technology came down, it became affordable, and now 80% of all households have smart TVs. Yeah, it's no different from just basic economic reality of what is going to take place. And trying to get that message across, I understand Rishi Sunak needs to grapple with it. The challenge is in the rhetoric of saying that net zero is a burdensome cost, that somehow people are going to be forced to pay £10,000 to £15,000 for these changes, you know, is a false one. And that's the challenge, because if we give out the signals that this is expensive and costly and something that's going to be done to people, when that was never the case, and it's fundamentally dishonest to say that, you know, that's the challenge we face, because already investors internationally are saying, you know what, I might just pause my investment for the moment to actually understand what is actually happening in the UK. And that's the big challenge that I think, you know, we do face, is that we are in a global net zero race. And whereas we have been leaders in the past, like it or not, you know, other countries are catching up. Macron has committed to 1 million heat pumps by 2030. They're already on 500,000 in being installed a year. If you look, obviously, what's happening in the States, it's not just about the money. We can never compete with that.
Chris, sorry to interrupt you, but if heat pumps are so fantastic, and I haven't got any skin in the game, but if they're so fantastic, then why does the government need to subsidise them to the tune of £7,500?
Well, the challenge around the subsidies is bringing...
That's tax. You say it's not going to be costly, but, you know, that is taxpayers' money, right?
But the challenge around any subsidy is bringing down the overall learning cost of the technology, and it's already fallen sort of dramatically in the past couple of years. It's the same with solar. It's the same with onshore wind. You know, we had contracts for difference, which has now seen the strike price fall dramatically, you know, significantly over 10 years, and that will be the case with heat pumps also. We've seen today, I think, publication that the price of a heat pump will be less than a gas boiler even without the subsidy. And that's because we don't have the manufacturing capabilities, and the biggest cost is obviously the labour market cost. So hopefully we will be supporting, you know, that this money that's going into heat pumps is also about reinvesting into the British economy. And what must come with it is, you know, bringing heat pump factories, you know, to this country, not just, you know, importing these things. So we see also an energy security question around local content. Yeah, and, you know, we need more of them. But the challenge, as always, is how do we, you know, use the role of government to incentivise and then move forwards at a point where they will be cheaper, and they are coming down. And yeah, the challenge, I think, is making sure our policy frameworks reflect that and don't waste taxpayers.
Emily, can I come in just on a
quickly, and then I'll go to and then I'll bring Sam.
So because I don't think we should be on a council of doom here. You know, Chris is correcting what he's saying, but we've done really well. And there are little things that consumers have done that they haven't noticed. So what percentage of German households have got smart meters in them? Just a guess. Audience, have a guess. No, oh God,
20.
we've killed them all. Right. No. 0. What percentage of UK households voluntarily have got smart meters in them, roughly? 60. It's about 60. So that's not government mandated. That's people. That's us saying have a smart meter, because then, you know, you can see when the kids have left something really. You've left the heater, oil heater on, because you can see the meter going round. And a big chunk of what we're already delivering there is doing really well. My answer to be why would you need to support the installation of a heat pump is because you might, the heat pump itself may actually be very cost effective compared to a boiler, but you may have to chuck a load of extra insulation, either externally, internally, to stop your house being a colander. You might need to get the squeezy foam out around the, what is it? 20% of what percentage of our housing stock is before 1910? Is it about 6 million homes, something like that? The 7.5 grand on the 7.5 grand on mine. I haven't got a heat pump yet, and I haven't got a heat pump because I need to spend 12 grand on insulation because the oldest part of the house is 1910. And so I will, when I do it, I will spend that subsidy on the insulation to enable the heat pump.
Well, of course, that's not affordable for everyone, right?
No, that's why I haven't got one yet.
Take those steps, so it's very difficult. Sam, what would you like to see from government?
I think just to kind of just come back to where you guys were before, when we looked at the PM's announcement, we still saw consensus on the big ticket items, and we still saw consensus on the major delivery, the major stuff that we're going to need in that electricity backbone. Where I'd answer your question is, I'd probably say if you thought of the three major plates, at least in my world, for electricity infrastructure delivery, one is the offshore wind plate moving, two is the kind of networks plate moving, and three is the flexibility plate spinning. And I think the offshore wind one was spinning super, super quickly and is now in a bit of a wobble, but I don't see it as unfixable. It's minor tweaks to the policy, getting the prices right to deal with inflation. That is not rocket science, frankly. The networks bit, and I share the points actually made by both the all the panelists, that actually within the small print was a very good networks announcement from the PM. We need focus on grid, and if that can be translated into action in the way it has on the big ticket transmission stuff, that is undoubtedly good news. But the plate that for me really isn't spinning is this flexible clean power for when that wind isn't blowing. I slightly fear that if we don't end up pushing harder at CCUS, harder at hydrogen, harder at pump storage, we'll end up just with unabated gas on the system. And I don't think that is in the best interest of net zero.
Thank you. Tom, it's often said by some that we're a country of NIMBYs who don't like seeing things being built in our back doors, our backyards. Do you see that in your polling and talking to people? We're very slow to get infrastructure built. I mean, look at HS2, but in terms of energy as well, there's always a local level blocking, whether it's solar panels or whether it's wind farms or whether it's, anything. It's very difficult.
Yeah, and I think part of the HS2 analogy is really apposite here, because at what point has HS2 really been sold to people in Manchester? We were in Manchester the other day doing focus groups on HS2, and people on the whole would much rather railway infrastructure connect Manchester to Liverpool and Manchester to Leeds and across. And obviously, any railway engineer knows that to do that, the HS3 project relies on part of HS2, and so there's this technical point. But if you just talk to people in Manchester, they, on the whole, won't understand that quite simple point. And so the lesson there, the reason that it's opposite, is you have to take the public with you. And to do that, you have to educate, you have to teach, you have to be persistent, and you have to be consistent. You have to have a consistent message and one that's designed to take the public with you. And if you do that, and if you don't spring surprises on people, then that, as I say, the local picture will align with that national picture where people are overwhelmingly demanding renewable energy, secure energy that is not coming from abroad. And it's that challenge that I think is often kind of missed in the technical language, in kind of bigger policy, in the bigger policy picture. Often we forget how is just an ordinary voter hearing about this. And the HS2 thing again is interesting because there's that very long lag between the thing being designed and spent and the public actually having the real debate amongst themselves about the kind of water cooler debate about, which bit's good, which, is it too much money, how much is it costing? And you just got to be really, really aware of where the public are on these things, what message they're taking away. And I guess final point is go for carrots. And I think everyone on the panel has said aligns with this. Go for carrots, not sticks. People just do not like, especially at the moment, in the middle of a cost of living crisis, people, even if there's no cost involved, people just don't like being told what to do, but especially where there's a cost involved.
Catherine, what's your thoughts on that? Because I think it is true that it is rather difficult to build important infrastructure in this country, and it's holding us back, in my view.
I did 6 months helping George Osborne set the Northern Powerhouse Partnership up. It's literally the reason I'm in this job, because I was working up in the northwest, getting on a train on a Monday, going down south to work, and then going home at weekend, because our kind of social life and play aspect up here, I don't know how many of you are locals, but, you know, Peak District, Lake District, North Wales, fantastic. You know, there's not enough hills in London, sorry, Chris. Two things for me. I think we desperately need to separate infrastructure planning from housing planning. They're two completely different things. I want strong environmental protections, but if you've got a project that's on its 5th environmental consultation, which I think I heard the other day, you know, that's not a great way to build infrastructure. But I also think that it starts to play into a decentralisation view. So forgive me, Chris, I genuinely don't know where you were in Parliament on the first debate. I wasn't. I'm a 2019 MP for HS2. But I would have always done HS3 first, because that's the biggest problem. You know, the connecting the northern economies together and creating it as a hub and spoke. But interestingly, I wouldn't have tried to tunnel through a load of undocumented mine works between Crewe and central Manchester, because that's Swiss cheese. That's why the Etihad keeps ending up with sinkholes on the road on the way into it. So I would have said, right, where can we get a bang for a buck, where you go Warrington, turn right. You know, this used to be the station. Why do we need to tunnel into Piccadilly? Why don't we come back in here? So I would do it, but I would do it with more how fast can you do it and how quick can you get your bang for your buck, rather than perhaps gold plating stuff. Just because London's got a tunnel. Do we need a tunnel? No, I just need a railway quicker, honestly.
Well, electric vehicles, a big focus on climate net zero policy. Do we have enough electricity to fuel the transition to electric vehicles, Chris? Are we ready? It seems we don't have enough charging points and other infrastructure.
So obviously this is a really important point why the Net Zero Review sort of looked at everything in the round to make that challenge into government. Where are the barriers that we currently face? It's not all motherhood and apple pie, and making sure that when it comes to grid and infrastructure, we put things first and we make sure that we align what needs to happen. Just in the same way when we decarbonised our electricity system, we focused on getting off coal, and then we've now moved forwards subsequently after that. So having that sequential approach is really important. But I would say the other thing is we can do this more effectively by taking a place-based approach that puts greater trust, if we give greater responsibility to regional devolved sort of leaders, to local authorities. The evidence and analysis shows that we can do net zero far cheaper. The challenge that we've got is obviously some local authorities just don't have the capability or the capacity to actually plan out these sort of charging points. I personally am in favour of local area energy planning, that we have now developed these frameworks. What's really important about that is that once we know what needs to be done, we can also work out where you potentially don't need the taxpayer to be on the hook, because there is a huge investment opportunity where we've seen in my area in Bristol, for example, Bristol City Leap planning out a district heating network where we've crowded in £424 million worth of private finance from Boston company Amoresco. And I think that's the same case to be made with electric charging vehicle points. Rather than have this sort of binary thing of like, right, the government needs to pay for it, where can we learn the lessons from HS2 about actually understanding how to map this out and how to then also finance and invest in it. But it should be a just transition. It's got to be a whole of society approach. And at the moment, it's fine for Londoners. They've got all the charging points, and we've got some great technologies and apps where people can find the charging points. But we literally, if you go down to Cornwall, for people who want to go on holiday there, they're not going to be able to drive their EVs down there and sort of charge them at the same time. So real issues, but they have to be solved. It's locally led.
I don't know if you saw, Catherine, but there was a report the other day about charge rage. Apparently they're having to hire marshals to monitor, because people are having fights over the chargers because there aren't enough.
So I'm a tree hugger and I have a petrol car. I'm going to go on the Anderson's GV show with a T-shirt that says tree hugger on it, by the way.
Love it.
I've already cleared it with him. But I have a 1 litre petrol Volkswagen Up, and the reason I do it is because living in the bit in Game of Thrones, you know, where there's snow and wolves, i.e. Preston. I cannot get to London on one charge in any available electric car. I can't do it. So say, I know, some loony dictator decides to, I don't know, do something daft like invade Ukraine, and I need to get to London in a Wanner. I can't do it in an electric car. I have to tap people on the shoulder at Warwick Services with, go, excuse me, madam, do you know who I am? You know, it's just not practical. So I've made the choice as far as I can. So I'm not driving a big diesel. It's a very efficient 1 litre petrol engine. And I think others are making those choices.
So is your hope that by the time you buy it...
No, but to your point, do we have enough electricity? Yeah, they will get better. But do we have enough electricity? No. And the answer to that is unashamedly nuclear. So we're sat bang in the middle of the Northwest Nuclear Arc at the moment, and if I try and mirror image it, my father, my dad, my cousin, my mates, the boys I go to the football with, the girls in Warrington, Cemais, Wilver at Anglesey, Trawsfynydd in North Wales with potential for pump storage. You've got Capenhurst, Warrington. We make nuclear fuel at Springfield, just north of me in Lancashire, Sellafield, Moorside. The skills and capability there. I went and talked to a load of people down, I think it was Surrey or Sussex or something like that. And they were like, God, what's this about SMRs being like, we don't want nuclear. Fine, we'll have 3 of them. You know, we're going to put the infrastructure in for the amount of offshore energy that's coming in, you know, and the improvements in how it crosses mine, for example. Let's get arrays of SMRs on nuclear licensed sites and let's get on with this great British nuclear competition. You know, we're down to 6. That's fantastic news. We've got homegrown, but there are other technologies in there. And let's make sure that we're open to innovation, both in not only in fusion, but in fission, you know, taking very small things and throwing them together to release energy. Some exciting stuff there that the UK is genuinely world leading in. So do we have enough energy? No. How do we get that? We get that via nuclear, which is a proven technology. And then you can stick as load and many hydrogen electrolyzers as you like on the edge of a baseload nuclear, create pink hydrogen, you know, store it. You know, I know that's not the problem that Sam's trying to solve, which is the intermittency of renewables. But if you create an increased baseload, then the renewable intermittency has got more flexibility within it.
Yeah, Sam, do you want to come in on that question of nuclear?
Yeah, and for the broader question of just electricity more broadly, we do need more nuclear, we need more offshore wind, we need more flexibility, we need all of it. I'm not sitting here picking and choosing technologies. I want all of it. There's a really important underlying part, though, which Chris alluded to, particularly for the EV part of this, is we do need to get the best out of local authorities. We need to get the best out of people who know their area, the distribution businesses who run the local electricity grids. We need to have a different type of framework, really, which is more sort of National Grid call it kind of scenarios-based investments. So you can actually make investments ahead of the direct need so that we're ahead of the customer rather than waiting for the customer to request something, then it's kind of already too late. So there's a whole change in the way that we need to regulate the electricity networks actually to kind of keep pace with all the investments that we're talking about.
We need a grid proper sorted, yeah.
Tom, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I think just on this point of investing ahead, you would think it's perhaps a tough sell with the public. But if you ask them, do you want to? I mean, you give the public 2 choices. Do you want to invest ahead, or do you want to wait till it's necessary? I think people understand that just in time often isn't a great idea, and actually, you know, just in time in business doesn't work with the public. And so actually people are overwhelmingly supportive of investing ahead for grid and for projects to deliver renewable secure energy. So I mean, from that point of view, the public are on exactly the same side.
Yeah, I think the public get a bit depressed though when these, you know, building a nuclear plant, for example, takes decades.
Yeah.
And you know, it's hard to see when that benefit is going to come.
Yeah, I think
if only investments had been made sooner.
I think there might be a kind of, we haven't polled it directly, but there might be a kind of new scepticism of mega projects, like the Hinkley Point size stuff. But that's all to the good, I think, for other renewable projects, other grid projects that don't have that kind of same scale. That you know, there's nothing essentially stopping them.
And Catherine, in terms of levelling up, the aim of levelling up, How do you see new energy infrastructure, clean infrastructure playing in that? How can this help with regional inequalities?
Well, I wouldn't say we have got regional inequality because we have got some of the best placed skills and heritage to deliver on it known to man. You're not going to find a bunch of people making 1/12 scale steam engines with a metal lathe in central London in the nicest possible way. We've got the skills, we've got the space, we've got the heritage. If anything, you know, what we're going to do is level up the south by providing them with our kind of skills and capabilities. And let's face it, possibly even selling you our water. She says rather cheekily, you've seen plenty of how munificently it is available in Manchester at this week. But semi-seriously, where else in the world have you got a kind of a 5 or 6 year old little girls getting taken by granddad and shown how to make stuff that is still entirely relevant? Genuinely doesn't happen. You know, Sam's nodding. The space, the energy, the heritage, the culture. Ooh, she's got an apprenticeship at BAE Systems. Ooh, she's done well. That is, you cannot buy that. And I think people are starting to come into it. And that's why I mention nuclear in particular, because it's a specialist kind of area for us in the Northwest. And it's also somewhere where we're leading. How many if we go back to Germany again, I'm not picking on them, I love the Germans, but, you know, their coalition, their Green Party was anti-nuclear. You know, look how close to being in a right pickle they got when the Russian oil and gas was turned off. And people understand its energy security, its great jobs, its family heritage. So we will share our munificence with other regions.
Chris, on that point too, we had, what's his name? Gary Smith, big union boss, talking about net zero, saying it's a debate for the virtue signalling middle classes, and saying we've been promised this green revolution and all of these jobs. Where are they? Do you see some truth to what he said there? Are all these green jobs, are we seeing them?
Well, I think you can point to a number of opportunities that are already existing, whether on the coast of the northeast, whether you look at sort of what Ben Houchen has sort of set out with Net Zero Teesside and that sort of wider vision of a manufacturing reindustrialization of certain manufacturing communities that have been deindustrialized in the past. In my area, we'll come back to nuclear here, we've seen 28,000 new jobs. 80% of those are locally based on the back of Hinckley, and there are other infrastructure sort of projects where we are seeing sort of similar sort of new jobs, additional jobs being created. Net Zero Review was clear that there is opportunity for 480,000 new additional jobs in the construction and retrofit industry alone. We need 27,000 extra new heat pump engineers, and an enormous opportunity to create a retrofit industry to be able to meet the growing need to reduce our energy demand, to get off gas. So this is important, but in a way, tackling, meeting these challenges head on is really important. If you look at what's happened in the States, the messaging has been one around job creation. And it's not just been about green jobs. I think one of the false starts we've had is to somehow see a green job as being somehow distinct from any other job. And as I said, I've tried to get across today that this transition it should be normalised. It's no different from any other transition that's going to take place. And we've gone through plenty of transitions historically. But making sure that we can set out very clearly, what are the building, the engineers, the construction workers we need, because we have a huge skills gap. And the challenge is not just about training young people and apprenticeships, and that's all very well and good. It's about retraining existing workers also, that needs to happen at pace. I'd love it if we could get onto this messaging so we could meet some of those challenges around what do these green jobs look like, where are these opportunities. The challenge will be trying to find people to actually fill them. I think
Can I add manufacturing to that? So 15% of the Lancashire's economy is manufacturing. This council of doom that we don't make it anymore. Well, yeah, we do actually. We just make it up here. And the great example of what's a green job is Stellantis at Ellesmere Port. So I was actually stood to be the member of Parliament there, and mysteriously was rejected by the good people of Liverpool. But I went round the factory. It hadn't had investment in it for decades. The pictures on the wall were those kind of Morris Marinas, you know, those slightly orange things with chrome bumpers. It's now, and Stellantis has now invested to make it an EV factory. So that's what I'm talking about. That's skills, heritage, stuff that money can't buy, attracting money in because we've got the net zero commitment and we're moving it forward. I just want to add to your point, Chris, that you're making, which is it's not just about retrofitting green, it's about the 2.0 of existing and historic industry.
Yeah, I've been talking to a few people at this conference who work broadly in the green energy industry, and skills, massive problem. Don't have, you know, these jobs going, but don't have the expertise, and they put that to not enough emphasis on apprenticeships rather than, you know, A-levels, university. Right, should we take some questions from the audience? Who would like to ask one? Okay, should we take one here and the lady at the back in green?
Hi, Robert McElveen from the Mineral Products Association. So our members include cement, who will be using an enormous amount of electricity for CCUS and various other things. So I suppose my question's more on the user end rather than the grid end. But to what extent is that important for local economies and local industries, especially on the manufacturing side? How much is that understood by the public to be linked to this whole infrastructure challenge?
I missed that a little bit. Did you all get that one?
How cement's linked to local jobs?
How the electricity demand for existing industries to decarbonise is how well that's understood by the public in terms of sort of infrastructure development, and how much people sort of draw the link between the two.
Okay, thank you. And at the back?
Hi, blimey, that was a bit hefty, sorry. My name's Miranda Barker, I'm the Chief Exec of East Lancs Chamber of Commerce, where 37% of my chamber membership are advanced manufacturers, thank you very much. Charging infrastructure is definitely a constraint on people going forward with purchasing their electric vehicles, and grid infrastructure is not only holding back our future development, it's holding back current economic expansion now, and I think that message doesn't always reach Whitehall. But going forward, we really need infrastructure to be led by government commitment. So their commitment to planning procedures, for instance, all the local authorities would love to set baseline levels for low carbon tech in their housing structures, in their commercial buildings, but they're really worried about displacing builds to somewhere else. So they really would love government to make a baseline across the UK of every new build's got to be at a certain level. And the same thing with procurement practices. It's great to see the NHS leading the way and saying you've got to have a carbon reduction plan if you supply us bagels or bandages from the 1st of April, but can we have the rest of the public sector doing that too? Yeah. Thanks.
Right, excellent. Who would like to come back on one of those questions, or both? Catherine?
Do people understand that energy industry is going to need a load of energy? I think, yeah. You know, you think about the cement factory in Hope in the Peak District, for example, or, you know, those communities that have got steel manufacturing in, like Scunthorpe. You know, the talk about electric arc furnaces in, you know, where the relative limitations are. I think it's there. I think Miranda's point, which is there actually is an enormous, is what I was trying to cover at the start, Miranda. There's actually an enormous appetite for people to do their own solar panels and their own wind turbines, and they're being blocked by planning at the moment. And if I had a magic wand, I would just get us out of the way and make sure that the grid has this idea of waiting for slots is gone. That I'm normally a bit leery about build it and they will come. But the scale of the electrification challenge just to me makes it a no-brainer. You can build it and we will use it.
I think also the industrial point is really important to get this message across, you know, around net zero. Because, you know, net zero is not about meat taxes. Net zero is not about, you know, sort of imposing things on households. The most startling statistic in the net zero review, you know, for me, is 8% of all businesses, in industry, are responsible for 80% of the UK's gas use. So we already use an incredible amount of energy, you know, anyway, and moving that across to electricity, that's the challenge. If we crack that, you know, we're more than halfway and beyond So getting that sense of prioritisation is really important. And then with that, it relates to the planning question as well, because micro generation, on-site generation is really important. Thinking about how the grid isn't just a national grid. And I think this is also a real important challenge for the next general election, where there is a dividing line between Labour and the Conservatives around the date at which we can achieve a net zero grid. And actually, we're not going to be able to do it by 2030. I don't support Labour's vision. It's 2035 is the least we can possibly do. But obviously, all the regulatory and legislative frameworks are before a sort of net zero world. So everything needs to be updated. But how do we maintain a twin track approach which uses our existing sort of frameworks and then moving us across onto new planning frameworks? And that's where the MPPF needs to be updated, and where we need also to create new models of local consent to take local neighbourhoods with us so they can see the economic return as communities as well for what's going to happen. But then also, I would just say on procurement, go back to the cement point, government's the largest procurer of cement and steel in the country. So if they can put the standards in place, then you've got a demand, an off-take market by which to then operate and make investments and ultimately a profit.
Sam?
Just 2 comments. I think on the cement side, I think actually one of the great successes of this government in this area has been the industrial clusters. The beginning of those processes, while I would criticise them for not being fast enough, the reality is they've made a very messy policy area and started to move it forward in some sort of semi-systematic way, which I think is quite an achievement, actually, and hopefully your industry can kind of plug into that in a decent way. And I agree with Catherine's point, no one wants bridges to nowhere, and that's what you fear with kind of anticipatory investment. But the reality is we're at a point where the grid, we just need to prioritise pace over perfection. We can get the perfect regulatory setup a bit later on. We just need to get on and build, is the reality.
Yeah. I think the question of do the public understand that net zero equals electrification is a really interesting one. And I think with any kind of technical question like this, when it meets the public, what you're really looking for is a really good analogy that the public already understand. And I think electric vehicles, EVs, have performed that role wonderfully. And I think, perhaps if you ask people to literally do the write it down, they wouldn't be able to tell you exactly what the ups and downs are. But at gut level, I think people understand that net zero equals electrification, which is really good news. But the flip side of that, and I think we've seen some of this recently, is that you need to also reassure that the electricity is going to be there, because otherwise you get these arguments that, well, there isn't going to be enough electricity, therefore we shouldn't switch to EVs, things like that. And so there's that people already understand it, but there's that then second point, you need to reassure them there's going to be enough electricity for them to do what they want to do, which I think there is, but you need to reassure on that point.
Should we take some more questions? This man in the middle there, and the man at the front.
Thanks. Chris Hewitt from Solar Energy UK. So I wanted to build on some points that Chris started making there. There's other investment in the on-site generation world which is really starting to take off. So we expect there to have been about 2 billion worth of investment in rooftop solar by the end of the year, in the last 12 months. That is more solar installations than at the very, very height of the feed-in tariff in the beginning of the 2010s. But then you add in the sort of the supermarkets, the logistics, the warehouses, the water industry, some of those are on site, and it starts to look like quite a significant amount. Couple in batteries, we have members who want to build factories to build batteries in the UK, residential batteries as well as the EV ones. There's already a factory in Grimsby which is making EV chargers. A lot of that is going to be installed not just on the motorway network and on the road network, but in people's homes. So again, a lot of that EV charging will happen in your own driveway. And that answers some of the issues around rural areas as well. So I think it's obviously the urban areas don't have those. So I think those opportunities and those investments are really starting to scale. And I think the rhetoric we're hearing from the Prime Minister is just missing that. It's all about fear and cost, whereas actually there's a huge amount of investment just starting to ramp up now.
Interesting. Should we take the second question and then we can come back?
Hi, Sean Holston. I'm a party member in Cheshire, but I also work in stakeholder engagement in the energy industry. So the main issue is that when we go and speak to members of the public, they are in favour of cleaner, homegrown energy. But when you go and say, well, we want to build it there, on that field next to you, then that's where the opposition comes from. So what do we do to make renewable energy more incentivised for local communities?
Great questions. Catherine, you were about to jump in. So should we go? Rishi Sunak, he's not talking about what's happened already and all the promise, and things are moving quicker than he makes out.
Yeah, I think I'm going to gently push back on you because those of us that really care, and I was Alex Sharma's PPS, so like Chris, 2 weeks in the glamorous Portakabin in Glasgow for COP26. Those of us that are there and are engaged in this topic, really, we know that we're doing really well. They know that we're the fastest decarboniser in the G7 and the G20, almost 50% less. Your average man on the street doesn't. Now, I think there is an interesting question about where this propaganda is coming from that people are buying. But I spent a lot of time talking to people. I was telling that silly story about my plumber phoning me up and shouting at me. That's a guy whose job it is in the industry, and he thought that we were going to impose taxes. And I think the PM speech is not to the converted, it's not to the solar industry, it's not to Alex Sharma's PPS. It's to people who genuinely thought we were going to make them do a lot of things that were never going to do. It was never even in Chris's report, and that's one of the forefront reports for kind of, taking ourselves forward on the green agenda. So the PM's talking to a different audience than you, I think, is the way I would put it. Yeah, okay, but I'm very happy to speak to any of your investors, and I'm sure anybody is, because the targets didn't change, but if we don't take people with us, they will kick right off, and we will lose them, and we won't actually achieve consolidate the gains that we've already got. And I would like to go further and faster, but the best thing I can say to someone in my patch is, I haven't got an electric car. I've got a petrol car and they go, oh, right, she gets it. So she's not going to make me get something that's impractical. So I think we need to stay on the right side of that.
You should have one, though, really.
Well, how do you want to pick me up at Warwick Services when I run out of electricity?
No, you have to sit there for 2 hours.
Yeah, I can't do it. Yeah.
I hope they get better, these electric vehicles, because we're putting a lot of emphasis on them.
It is
Lots of
300
investment.
miles. There's not that many people that need 300 miles all the time. But it's, as a member of Parliament for the North of England, I am exceptional, but it's still true.
You are indeed. Chris, the local NIMBYism point that was raised over there, it's very real.
Yeah, and I think the challenge is about looking at communities and recognising that no one community is the same as another. So, if we're trying to look at creating new methods by which we can generate community consent, I'm really interested in how we empower communities to look at this. Actually, we've only built 2 wind turbines, I think, in the past year in England, compared to, I think, sort of 18 in the Ukraine, given they've got war going on. But sort of one of those turbines is actually down in Bristol. Down in Lockleys, and it's a community energy project that is now got cheap self-generated energy from this single sort of turbine that's going back into producing lower bills for the community. And everyone seems very happy with what has happened there. Now, why have we not been able to scale that up? It's in spite of rather than what the government's achieved, that they've managed to really sort of push this forwards. And the challenge is our planning system isn't fit for purpose, but we need to create a consent mechanism where in Scotland, and some of this stuff is devolved, they've already got the guidance and stuff that we could borrow from them. In Italy, they give them a fixed cut of like 1% of the turnover, not just the profit. And that's financially the communities like that. But not every community wants money. They don't want to have their mouths sort of stuffed with green gold. They want potentially community projects that might be something different. So I think it's having that sense of flexibility and adaptability. And the last thing we want is SSE turning up in a local community, being like, you know what, we're going to buy you out. And you're going to take what we're given. That's an unequal dynamic. So making sure that communities are placed in a position where they get a return, but equally, obviously, there is a challenge. Like once you see examples of community energy projects, like down in Lockleys, other people then say, oh, why can't we have that? And you start to then see best practice no longer being best practice, and very much the Net Zero Review was about ending best practice and making it the new normal. So there is a journey to be had, but we've got to be recognise that each community has got to be judged on its own values.
Sam, would you like to come in on either of those?
Yeah, just on the community part. Just I thought Chris nailed it. But the thing I would probably say is where we've found it most successful on onshore wind in Scotland was where you did have a community fund, but the community decided what to do with it. We weren't sitting there, rolling it out and deciding exactly what you do with it. We had a very open and clear, we still do, sort of amount of money we would give on a wind farm, and they go about and look after what they want to do with it, which I think is the right way of doing it. I think we're going to have to think about something different for the transmission infrastructure, because I think that is impacting people's houses and lives. I think we're going to have to do something, working with government, some way of systematically providing something for those communities as well. Onward did quite a good report on that. I think there's a lot that could be said for some of the activity in there. But as Chris says, it's not just financial, it's about listening to the communities, trying to actually get a sense of what they want out of it, and then trying to react and respond.
What's interesting, though, is we're almost having two debates. We've got a whacking great big massive lever that we've got to pull to kind of generate the scale of electricity that allows us to do stuff. But then we often end up talking about these relatively, on the big picture, de minimis projects that are about creating the argument that would allow people to feel bought into the transmission infrastructure that Sam's talking about. And I think forgive me, I've got a science degree, and one of the things I find fascinating about political discourse is you talk about something that's this big in the same sentence as you talk about something that's this big, and communicating the difference to people that is almost what your world is, isn't it? You know, and actually how three small things that make no difference at all actually buy you the goodwill to get the big thing that actually really helps achieve the overall outcomes. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Catherine. I mean, the devil. I mean, exactly as Chris said, listening is the key. Start with listening, and we spend a lot of time polling in constituencies, focus groups in constituencies that have these infrastructure projects, and just listening to what people think about them before they happen. And I think, again, as the panel have said, the devil is often in the detail. Is it incentive payments? Well, maybe. Is it, what is the incentive payment? Maybe the incentive payment is net negative, as I think some of us have indicated. So you just have to really, really carefully listen and take each project unfortunately, you have to take each project as it comes.
Well, that's a good way to finish this wonderful panel. Thank you very much for your time. Let's say, and to the audience as well, for the great questions. So Sam Peacock, Tom Lubbock, Catherine Fletcher MP, Chris Skidmore MP, and I'm Emily Carver. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.